They called it genocide. In October 2025, Brussels exploded with outrage after an 87-page report accused Captain Ibrahim Traoré of leading a racial purge against white Europeans in West Africa. News anchors in Paris screamed ethnic cleansing, old footage was recycled. Sanctions were demanded, even the ICC was mentioned. But no one stopped to ask what really happened. Why are Europeans suddenly being removed from gold mines, from land, from influence? Is this justice or a threat to empire? Stay with us. Like, subscribe, and get ready, because the truth behind this scandal will shock you more than the headline ever could. If you still believe that a small nation can stand tall against the weight of global empires, if you believe Africa deserves to write its own story in its own voice, not through foreign tongues, if you've seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes, then this story belongs to you too. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not just to show support, but to walk with us. We are not just witnessing history. We are moving with a silent storm. The whispers have become thunder, and Africa is finally speaking back. Following the shocking allegations, the West moved quickly and ruthlessly. Headlines labeled, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a dangerous strongman. Brussels accused him of orchestrating an ethnic purge. Old video clips were edited to fit a new narrative. French commentators called for international sanctions, but no one questioned the timing. Why now? Why him? Why this sudden media frenzy around one African president behind the noise? Was a deeper fear. Captain Traoré wasn't begging for aid. He was evicting French troops, reclaiming gold mines, and talking sovereignty. For the first time in decades, someone from West Africa was refusing to kneel. Yet no one in Brussels mentioned the past. For centuries, Europeans stole African land, enslaved its people, and looted its resources and called it civilization. Now that Captain Ibrahim Traoré is reversing the roles, they cry foul. The same gold mines that funded foreign wealth left locals starving. The same land given back to Burkina families is now labeled hostile. But what about the real victims, the ones silenced for 400 years? When Traoré says no more stolen land, it's not hate. It's history correcting itself. And suddenly justice sounds threatening to those who once ruled without question. But Europe wasn't ready for what came next. Just hours after the EU's press conference, Julius Malema took the stage in Johannesburg and tore the narrative apart. Cameras rolled. The whole continent watched. He didn't hesitate. White genocide. No, what you're witnessing is the fall of colonial privilege. What you call genocide is Africa saying, no more stolen gold, no more free land, no more silence. Every word hit like a slap. The room froze. But Malema kept going. Europe called slavery progress. They called occupation civilization. Now that Captain Ibrahim Traoré has removed French soldiers, returned land to his people, and refused to kneel, you call him dangerous. He looked straight into the cameras, not afraid, not apologizing. You're not angry because of racism. You're angry because your era of unchecked power is ending. It was a speech that needed no teleprompter, no script, just truth and fire. Malema didn't defend Captain Ibrahim Traoré with politics. He defended him with history, with memory, and with the voice of millions who've never been heard. That day, the world saw something rare, Africa speaking back, and this time it refused to whisper. As Malema stepped down from the podium, the silence in the press room was deafening, but outside, the world had already erupted. Within minutes, social media lit up across the continent. Tweets, reels, videos, voice notes, all carrying one message. Africa is awake. Hashtags flooded the timeline. Stand with Traoré. We're not your subjects. Malema speaks for Africa. What began as a Western media campaign had backfired. Young African students, farmers, engineers, artists were reposting Malema's words like scripture. But it wasn't just about him. It was about what Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood for. People saw in him a mirror of their own defiance, a leader who didn't speak in rehearsed statements, but with fire, with clarity, with backbone. He wasn't playing politics. He was reclaiming something sacred: dignity. And for a generation born into debt, corruption, and dependency, Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just a president. He was a signal, a rupture in the silence, a symbol that change, real African-led change, was not only possible, but inevitable. In every corner of the continent, people weren't just listening anymore. They were answering. And the voice they followed was his. And then came the moment no one expected. A week after the EU's outcry, during a tense session at the United Nations Human Rights Council, the European delegates repeated their demand: investigate the AES alliance, sanction its leaders, and take urgent action against what they called anti-white xenophobia. Their tone was righteous. Their accusations were sharp. They cited reports, played videos, pointed fingers, all aimed at one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. But they didn't see what was coming next. The delegate from Guinea calmly took the floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't wave papers or speak in fury. He simply asked one question, and the entire chamber went still. If expelling a land thief is called genocide, then what do you call the act of colonizing in the first place? The silence that followed was louder than any speech. No one had an answer. Not France, not Belgium, not the United Kingdom. For once, the usual power in the room had no script prepared, no statement ready, just stunned silence. That one question did what hours of debate could not. It flipped the narrative. It reminded the world that history has a longer memory than headlines, and that justice, if it's real, cannot be selective. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't need to respond. He sat beside Julius Malema, quiet, composed, and unshaken. Malema leaned slightly, gave a knowing smile, and nodded once. That was enough, because in that room and in that moment, it was no longer about defending Traoré. It was about defending a principle that Africans have the right to their own land, their own leaders, and their own future, without being labeled criminals for taking back what was stolen. Across Africa, people replayed the clip. The question from Guinea was turned into murals, T-shirts, even school debates. Young people began to ask more of their own governments. Why aren't we doing what Traoré is doing? Why are we still begging when we have so much to protect? The storm had shifted. What began as an accusation became a revelation, and at the heart of it stood a captain who didn't blink. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had not spoken a word that day, but in his silence he said everything. He showed the world that real power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits still while the old empires tremble, and perhaps that's what frightened them most. In the days that followed, the world shifted not suddenly, but unmistakably. Western media continued their coverage, trying to reframe the conversation. New headlines appeared: Burkina Faso, defiant African leaders under fire, UN fails to act. But something had already broken, not in Africa, but in Europe. The old language no longer held its grip. Words like order, stability, and international norms rang hollow. For generations, these terms had been used to justify foreign control, economic subjugation, and military presence across the continent. But now, with Captain Ibrahim Traoré seated beside leaders like Julius Malema, and backed by voices from Guinea, Mali, and Niger, those words began to crack. Because for once, Africa was not asking, it was stating, not pleading, declaring. And what it declared was, this our land is not a crime scene, our resistance is not extremism, and our dignity is not up for negotiation. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered in front of the presidential palace, holding signs that read, "We stand with Traoré. Africa is rising, no more puppets." In Nairobi, Dakar, Kinshasa, and even diaspora communities in London and Paris, rallies echoed the same message. The silent majority had found its voice, and it spoke with clarity, with anger, and with pride. But beyond the rallies and hashtags, beyond the speeches and headlines, something more profound had shifted the psychological border. The invisible wall that had for decades made Africans doubt their own power, that wall had cracked. Captain Ibrahim Traoré became more than a president. He became a reference point. He became the answer to a new generation of questions. Can we govern ourselves? Can we own our resources? Can we speak without fear? His silence at the UN was not weakness. It was strategy. Because the storm didn't need more thunder, it needed stillness. It needed someone to hold the line, and that's exactly what he did. He did not run from the accusations. He did not apologize for offending colonial sensitivities. He did not dilute his policies to appear more cooperative. Instead, he allowed the contradictions of the old world to reveal themselves, and they did. When Europe shouted genocide, Africa answered with memory. When they threatened punishment, Africa responded with unity. And when they expected fear, Africa stood up taller than ever. So if you're watching this from across the globe, whether in a university dorm, a crowded cafe, or a quiet room where history feels distant, remember this. Africa is no longer waiting to be saved. It is saving itself. And if you believe like we do, that the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes reflects the fire in your own, then this is your story too. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not just for content but for a cause. Because what started as a whisper has become a storm, and storms don't ask permission. They arrive, they cleanse, they change everything. If you still believe that a small nation can stand tall against global giants, if you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story in its own voice, on its own terms, if you've seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes and felt it burn something awake in your soul, then this story is yours too. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, not just to support, but to walk beside us. This is not a trend, it's a turning. Together we are moving through a wave of awakening, one that no algorithm, no empire, and no silence can stop. The whispers have become a storm, and the storm has begun to speak. Now the question is, will you answer? The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré is not merely a political episode, it is a mirror held up to the world, forcing uncomfortable questions about power, justice, and historical memory. It teaches us that narratives are not always neutral, and that those who control the global microphone often dictate the definition of words like freedom, democracy, and peace. When the West labeled Traoré's actions as white genocide, it exposed not only political bias, but also the deep fragility of a system built on unchallenged dominance. One of the most important lessons from this story is that reclaiming sovereignty is often mistaken for aggression when it comes from the global South. Captain Traoré's efforts to expel foreign military forces, nationalize gold mines, and prioritize local ownership were not acts of hatred, they were expressions of self-respect. Yet the swift backlash reveals how global institutions often protect old power structures under the guise of international law and human rights. This calls for a critical evaluation of who gets to define justice and whose voice is considered legitimate in the global conversation. Another lesson lies in the silence, the strategic silence of Captain Traoré, and the thunderous silence that followed the Guinean delegate's question at the United Nations. Silence in this case became a weapon more powerful than rhetoric. It reminded us that dignity doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it simply refuses to kneel. In a world overwhelmed by noise, outrage, and headlines designed to provoke emotion, this kind of poised resistance speaks volumes. Julius Malema's intervention also offers a powerful example of solidarity and the role of leadership in shaping continental identity. He did not defend Traoré out of politics, but out of principle. He reminded us that unity is not forged in convenience, but in shared history and common struggle. His words resonated because they were rooted in truth, the truth of colonization, exploitation, and the continued erasure of African agency in global affairs. Through Malema, we learn that leadership must have courage, and that courage sometimes means confronting uncomfortable truths, even when the world isn't ready to hear them. Perhaps the most lasting lesson from this story is that change no longer waits for permission. The youth of Africa, and indeed of the world, are watching, thinking, questioning. They are not as easily swayed by official statements or press conferences. They respond to authenticity, and in Captain Ibrahim Traoré, They see a figure who is not perfect but real, a man who embodies defiance vision and the audacity to say no when the world expects silence. This story teaches us that the age of quiet submission is ending. The language of resistance is evolving. And as the storm gathers, it is no longer about whether the world will listen. It is about whether it can afford not to. After watching the story, I sat in silence for a while. Not because I was confused, but because I was moved. Deeply moved. I never imagined that a political leader from a small West African nation could hold up a mirror to the world so powerfully. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't throw accusations or chase headlines. He simply stood his ground, and somehow that shook the foundations of global power more than any speech ever could. As someone from the diaspora, I've grown up hearing about Africa through the lens of loss of land identity power. We were taught to believe that corruption was natural, that dependency was inevitable, and that dignity was a luxury reserved for wealthier nations. But this story changed something. It reminded me that Africa was never weak. It was only silenced, and now that silence is finally breaking. I saw in Captain Traoré a quiet defiance, the kind that doesn't seek permission to exist, the kind that doesn't apologize for wanting freedom. When the West cried genocide, I understood it not as fear for lives, but fear of losing control. The accusation wasn't about protection, it was about power. And that's what makes this story so urgent. It's not just about Traoré. It's about what he represents. Julius Malema's words, too, struck a deep chord. He said what many of us have whispered in private for years. He reminded the world that Africa remembers, and that remembering is a form of resistance. His voice wasn't just powerful, it was necessary. It carried all the things we've wanted to say, but were told not to. He didn't ask for validation. He demanded recognition. What moved me most, though, wasn't just the politics, it was the unity. The response across the continent, the wave of support, the hashtags, the murals, it all felt like the birth of something we'd been waiting for. For once, we weren't divided by borders or languages. We were united by purpose. We were saying together that Africa will no longer be defined by others. The Guinean delegates' question at the UN: if expelling a land thief is called genocide, then what do you call colonizing in the first place will stay with me forever. It was simple, but it cut through centuries of diplomatic evasion and moral hypocrisy. That one sentence did what no policy paper or resolution ever could. It exposed the double standard, and it did so with dignity. This story didn't just inform me, it inspired me. It reminded me that even in a world ruled by spin and spectacle, truth still has power. And that power, when it comes from the people, is unstoppable. Thank you for telling this story. Thank you for reminding us who we are and who we can be. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré teaches us that in the 21st century, resistance is no longer defined by weapons or marches alone. It is also defined by narrative control, psychological courage, and symbolic gestures. The greatest revolutions today are not always loud. Sometimes they begin with a refusal to bow. What Captain Traoré demonstrated was not only political defiance, but also a reframing of Africa's position in global consciousness. For decades, African leaders have been forced to explain themselves, using Western vocabulary terms like aid partnership reform. But Traoré's actions abandoned that script. He spoke not in the language of appeasement, but in the logic of restoration. And that's why his silence at the UN was louder than any speech. He didn't accept the premise of the accusation, and that in itself was revolutionary. We learn from this that dignity cannot be negotiated, it can only be reclaimed. When Traoré expelled foreign forces and nationalized resources, he wasn't issuing a threat, he was realigning history. He was saying that sovereignty is not a favor to be granted, but a right to be asserted. This is a vital lesson for any people who have endured colonization, exploitation, or marginalization. Reclaiming your future often begins with redrawing the moral map. And sometimes that means refusing to justify your existence to those who once denied it. Another powerful lesson is that media can become both sword and shield. The coordinated backlash against Traoré was not spontaneous, it was orchestrated. News outlets, diplomatic platforms, and NGOs echoed each other's outrage using familiar buzzwords: genocide, instability, anti-democratic. But this raises an important question: who defines extremism? Who decides which movements are legitimate and which ones are criminal? Through this case, we see that global opinion is not neutral. It often serves the interests of those who benefit from the existing order. When African leaders act within frameworks approved by Europe or the US, they are praised. But when they break those frameworks to prioritize their own people, they are vilified. This forces us to confront the fact that international legitimacy is not always a measure of justice. Sometimes it's a reflection of power imbalance. Traoré's silence at the UN and the Guinean delegates' question: if expelling a land thief is called genocide, then what do you call colonizing in the first place, served as a masterclass in narrative reversal. Instead of defending himself against accusations, the African bloc demanded historical accountability. This tactic was not defensive, it was offensive. And that is perhaps the boldest lesson of all, that real power lies in the ability to shift the frame of reference. The colonizer becomes the questioned. The victim narrative gets flipped. This is not just political strategy, it's intellectual liberation. From Julius Malema's fiery speech to the viral support across African youth, we also learn that solidarity matters more than spin. In a media landscape dominated by manipulation, what cuts through is emotional honesty. Malema didn't try to be diplomatic. He was raw, unapologetic, and rooted in history. His words didn't just defend Traoré, they articulated a collective memory that too many institutions have tried to erase. And that's what made it powerful. In that moment, Africa wasn't just reacting, it was asserting, reclaiming, declaring its right to speak on its own behalf without intermediaries or filters. The lesson here is clear. Cultural confidence is as vital as economic independence. A continent that remembers its true history cannot be easily manipulated, and that memory becomes a weapon of resistance. The psychological shift that occurred after this event is perhaps the most profound. All across Africa and the diaspora, people didn't just protest, they began to question the assumptions they were raised with. Assumptions like Africa needs foreign aid, our leaders must align with the West, it's safer to compromise than to confront. These assumptions have kept entire generations locked in inherited inferiority. But when they saw Traoré calm, silent, and unshaken, refused to flinch, something broke. The illusion shattered. They saw that strength didn't mean volume, it meant presence. It meant refusing to play a rigged game. And in that realization, a new standard was born. The lesson here transcends Africa. It speaks to any community struggling against systems that define them through deficit. Traoré's story reminds us that history can be rewritten, but only by those brave enough to tear up the old script. You cannot beg for justice from those who built their wealth on your oppression. You must define justice for yourself and then act accordingly. The international response to Traoré also reveals the fragility of Western moral authority. Institutions like the UN or the ICC are often framed as neutral arbiters of human rights. But their selective outrage suggests otherwise. When leaders in the global South challenge neo-colonial structures, they are quickly framed as threats to global order. This hypocrisy teaches us that moral language is often deployed to protect strategic interests, not people. And so we learn that true resistance requires not just courage, but clarity. Clarity about where power lies. Clarity about what narratives are being spun. Clarity about who benefits when dissent is silenced. Traoré's story is not about a saint or a savior. It's about the audacity to confront this system with unflinching clarity and to do so on one's own terms. Another subtle but powerful lesson is the role of youth in political awakening. It was not diplomats who carried this message across the continent. It was students, artists, digital creators, everyday citizens who felt seen for the first time. Traoré became more than a man, he became a meme, a mural, a movement. And that teaches us something vital: symbolism matters. In an age where politics is often consumed in 15-second clips, the right image, the right question, or the right silence can mobilize millions. That's why leadership today must be both strategic and symbolic. It must not only act, but represent. And in Traoré, many saw themselves, not because he was perfect, but because he was unafraid. His story shows us that leadership is no longer about control. It's about conviction. It's about standing firm in the face of narrative warfare and refusing to be defined by others. This is a call to all leaders across continents and causes to stop asking for permission and start asking better questions. Questions like, who told us we needed saving? Who profits from our silence? And most importantly, who are we when we stop kneeling? In the final analysis, the lesson is, these movements do not need to begin with bloodshed. They can begin with memory, with a refusal, with one leader sitting quietly in a room full of accusers, while the world outside finally sees itself clearly, defiantly, unapologetically. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't just challenge Western power. He challenged the African imagination to dream beyond dependency. He offered a glimpse of what it looks like to govern, without shame, to reclaim, without fear, to lead without waiting for permission. And that is why his story is not just a moment, it is a mirror, a message, a mandate. And now it's up to us, those who have watched, who have listened, who have felt the storm rise, to decide what we do with it.